Okay, so it occurred to me I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's sold his house a while back. And we were talking about the fact that he's waiting to redeploy that capital into another house, right? He sold near the top of the market and he put that capital away, waiting, he's out renting now, waiting for the market to drop. So we were discussing this and we're talking about inflation. And after the conversation, it occurred to me that I was on the wrong track. And here's what I mean. So we generally look at inflation as like a CPI, an across the board type of an inflation number. Like the government will say it's like they're always shooting for that 2% target. But whatever it is, they'll tell you it's 3.8 and that's just a general inflation number. And Lord knows how they come to that number because it's never what we experience personally. We all know that. So that's another issue. But this is sort of different in a sense that, well, what just to flat out talk about it, what we were discussing was the fact that he's sitting on all this capital waiting, and of course those dollars are losing purchasing power. They're losing to inflation every year. So the longer he goes on waiting for a house, the more those dollars are getting inflated away. But it occurred to me after I got into this conversation that maybe I was a little wrong-headed, and here's why. So imagine that a house is a pretty big purchase for the average person, right? So it ties up a lot of the capital that we have, on average 30 to 35%. Well, not nowadays, it's getting closer to 50, but that needs to be corrected. But 30 to 35%, a third of your earnings are considered allocated towards housing. And that's considered a good number. So that's quite a bit, a third, considering all the other things that we have to have dollars for in our life, a third is quite a bit. So my point in that is, so stop and think about it. The dollars that he's sitting on, because they're actually, well, so here's was the epiphany I had. And this is probably some of the logic that government uses to come to their CPI too. This is probably how they come to this very, very low number, which I still think is way too low. But I'm beginning to see that there might be some validity to what they're saying. I hate to say, even though I still think their number is managed down too low. But if you stop and think about the money that the currency, I hate to use money in place of currency because it's incorrect language, bad presenter. The currency that he's got sitting that's waiting to be deployed in a house is really for a single purpose. It's not going towards groceries, which are inflating rapidly, or fuel, which is inflating rapidly, whatever that is. It's earmarked to go to another home. So in a sense, can we not treat this different than money that might be earmarked to go to food? I mean, think about it. The dollars he's sitting on, although measured against the CPI or measured against other things that are increasing in price, homes currently are decreasing in price. So in a sense, you could almost argue that the dollars that he's got earmarked specifically for going towards a home can be calculated differently, because those dollars are not going to be seen buying food or fuel. They're really earmarked for buying a home. So homes are going down in price. So isn't that deflationary? Doesn't that work against the inflationary side of your balance sheet, so to speak, your home balance sheet, where like 2/3, let's just separate the home into 1/3 and everything else into a 2/3 category to keep it simple? Wouldn't we be saying that this is working against the net across the board, or at least unto itself, the dollars that are earmarked for buying another home are actually gaining in purchasing power? So to some degree, that's going to offset the inflation that's experienced in the other 2/3 of our expenditures, which is really where most of the inflation is happening right now, energy and food. So I'm not sure how you would measure that into a CPI other than to run the numbers on ratios and stuff. And that's not what I'm here to do, but just to discuss the idea that, in fact, it's kind of good news that those dollars that you have set aside, that my friend has set aside for the home, are actually gaining in purchasing power because of the lowering prices. Now, it's not much consolation to the money we spend every day on other things that's going crazier and crazier, and we're constantly hearing from people on the web how much it's impacting them. Um, it it really is, to me, because that money is assigned for something, or that currency is assigned to something. We really have to kind of treat it in a vacuum and say that this is actually good news, and that was the intended outcome for holding back the the dollars and waiting for the market to drop, was to actually take advantage of lower prices. And so it's kind of a positive revelation to realize suddenly that you're really not losing on those dollars. The others, again, you can argue what the actual inflation rate is on consumer goods. There's something I think I briefly mentioned called the Chapwood Index that tracks 500 of the most common products that people buy. And for the last 2 years, it's been saying that's north of 20%, which is easily believable. So, I mean, I hate to give the government economists any credit, but now because of this revelation, I stopped and I started thinking, it's okay. Well, I can see how they can argue that inflation may be lower as an aggregate than the Chapwood Index, for example, that tracks the 500 top products. But I mean, over time, like, some people may only ever buy one home. I mean, you can only live in one home at a time, and a lot of people only ever do buy one home, and they live there for their whole life. So a lot more dollars are going to be deployed on the other two-thirds of our expenditures than on a home in many cases, or at least that should be the case. I mean, most of us live for quite a few years as an adult, and have to spend all those dollars on consumer goods every day. So, but again, also the other point to make is your inflation rate is personal to you. This is something that's not really discussed. We just buy into these numbers that we're handed because it's convenient and easy to have somebody else figure it out for you. But your inflation rate is personal to you. As I've often said to people in discussions, if you own a company and you're a sole proprietor of it, let's say a plumbing company, and you have 10 vans that are running all the time, you have a very high fuel cost. So the inflation rate of your personal finance is going to be different than somebody else, and that's not in that type of business and doesn't have a product line that's inflating at an excessive rate, because the obviously the economy is inflating in some areas and deflating in others. Real estate's deflating, and consumer goods are inflating. So obviously things don't inflate evenly across the board in an inflationary environment. And again, depending on your mix of different assets and different costs and expenditures, your numbers are going to be different. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think, I don't think everybody has to know exactly to the decimal what their inflation rate is, but it's not a bad idea to go through the exercise of understanding, just to get a ballpark idea, because it can probably help you make some better choices going forward. So anyway, for those of you that are run into that situation, for example, that you're sitting on some capital and you're ready to deploy it and are already savvy and aware of inflation and how it impacts you, consider the fact that because those dollars are earmarked, that they're really actually in a vacuum can be calculated differently. Obviously, in the overall, we would have to weigh the two sides out to get an accurate number in aggregate for ourselves. But at least the dollars that are allocated for buying a home, if you have those set aside, you can rest assured that they're actually increasing in value. So this is another oddity about dollars, that the fact that you'll often hear me talk about the dollar and how it's not a static measurement, it's not a standard, and so its way of measuring over time is distorted. And so this is just another example of how that's actually a fact. And if you truly understand dollars that way, you can take steps with your asset mixes and your asset purchases to mitigate some of that. So probably in the next video, I'm going to talk about that again. I think I have, as the channel trailer, I have a talk about owning multiple assets. And I was talking to a fellow we were getting into that. I think he had watched that video, and we were talking about multiple assets and why, and the nature of different assets and how they perform in your life. And I was kind of doing a little visual representation with some different assets, just kind of putting them on the counter and saying, okay, imagine this is moving that. And it kind of helped me see, and present the idea to the fellow that I was talking to, and he seemed to receive it really well. So I'm going to redo that talk in a shorter form, and actually do some visual representations of different assets and their movement and price, and how that can work to your advantage, and why gold's important in that, why gold is an overlooked asset in your tool mix. And we'll talk a little bit about risk mitigation, because that's really in times like this where the markets are moving, and at any time for that matter, risk mitigation, what you do with your dollars and how they perform in different environments due to inflation and asset inflation, can really make a difference to your outcome in the long run. And once the time is behind you, it's impossible to go back and catch up. So it's important to get that strategy right from the get-go, and going into the environment we're going into financially, which is not good for a lot of people. I mean, we're gonna see some rough times coming up. It's for a lot of people there. It's already there. But I heard a fellow the other day, Dave Collum. If you've never listened to Dave Collum, interesting guy. He's a professor at Cornell University, and he was saying pain. Oh, he's talking about Powell, the leader of the Fed, the head of the Fed, talking about alluding to there's going to be pain. He says in reality there really hasn't been yet. There hasn't been any real pain in the market yet. And I thought, yeah, I mean, we listen to, TikTok rants from people that are lower income, particularly because they all talk about their service jobs and stuff, and how they're getting clobbered by the inflation. And that's sad. But in general, in the markets, we still have all-time highs in the Dow, and we're close to all-time highs. And still, asset prices, other than say maybe commercial real estate, are still holding up generally pretty well. Homes have come down in the bubble areas and stuff. So it's kind of hard to predict what's going to happen next. But suffice it to say, it's going to be very ugly. So anyway, that's all I have to say about that. I could rant on about it a little longer, but I think that gets the point across. So anybody who's sitting on capital that's allocated toward as a house, and you're wringing your hands thinking, geez, with the inflation and everything, keep in mind that capital is specifically allocated, and is not really being affected negatively by the market. As long as the market continues to go down, lower prices are in our future, you're good to go. All right. Thanks for listening, folks. Have a great day.